In emergency management, the definition of a stakeholder is any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival or recovery of a given community.
This is the Stakeholder Prepping Podcast, where the tactical comes from the practical, and today, you become your own stakeholder.
Here are your hosts, Chris and AC.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you are the stakeholder in your own survival. And AC, before we jump into today's topic, I kind of want to make a plea to our listeners on this one. We put an awful lot of research and work into this episode, and we often ask people to buy something from a sponsor or an affiliate if they want to help out our show. But there's something that you can do as a listener that helps us out more than that, and it costs you absolutely nothing. If you enjoy listening to the show, especially if you like this episode and what we bring to you every week, then please go to whatever you listen to your podcasts on, whether it's Amazon, Apple, Spotify, even YouTube. Give us a 5-star review. It takes maybe 5 minutes and it helps us a ton. We probably put 15 or 16 hours of research into this episode alone, and we do that almost every week to bring you the content. So pretty please give us 5 minutes and leave us a 5-star review. And if it's good, we will absolutely read it on the show.
That's awesome. I like that. Yeah, absolutely. If you like listening to the shows, obviously, we phone a couple in here and there, but for the most part, I would say on average, we're probably dropping 15 man hours a week on shows. So yeah, if you like that, if you like listening to us, if you like coming back every week, please, wherever you listen to your podcast, go leave us a 5-star review. And if we like it, if it's a good one, we'll read it. That'd be kind of cool too. So today, we are diving into a topic that keeps many preppers up at night, and that is the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. And we're going to talk about its less understood cousin, the coronal mass ejection, or CME. So are these just sci-fi fantasies or like legitimate threats that you should be prepping for? And Chris, I think we might actually get a little hate on this because people are just so dug in on their opinions of EMPs and what they do. And I really want to just focus on the facts and some historical events that we can point to, and we can kind of inject our own opinions. And I definitely want to be clear about things that are just our opinions on this. But from my perspective, I don't know how you feel about this. I think EMPs have just become this very nebulous piece of prepper fear porn. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I completely 100% agree with all of that. We are undoubtedly going to get some hate mail on this one, but like I said at the very beginning, we probably put, I'd say for this episode, because we've delayed this one a lot.
Yeah.
We've probably delayed this by 10 episodes because we wanted to put in a little bit more research and a little bit more. We've probably got 30 to 35 man hours of research alone into this, much less writing the outline for it. So we kind of have some semblance of an idea of what we're talking about.
Right.
I
And
think
I would say that, Chris, you've got a background in the Army with some satellite communications where you guys were obviously very aware of EMPs, especially like from directed energy weapons that, foreign actors could use. In my world, I will say, I can't say a lot. What I will say is I have been, and I currently am involved in programs for the Department of Defense to what I'll say EMP proof certain equipment that they're using. And that's about all I can say with the security clearances I have right now. But I'm actively involved in that. So I think neither one of us are, physicists, but I think we both have some practical working knowledge of hardening of electronics, right?
We do. And without going into any classified intelligence information, what I focused on during my time with it was more the high altitude nuclear detonations, the hands in the
Hmm.
sky. That's what we were focused on with with my particular segment. So it really kind of comes down to not all EMPs are built the same. And I know you're going to harp on this one throughout the episode, AC, but
Yeah.
not all EMPs are the same. I think a lot of kind of the renewed interest in EMPs and CMEs has really kind of come from one particular series. It's called 1 Second After by William R. Forston. And it was a great series. I actually read the whole thing. I have written him fan mail. Like it was a great series. I think a lot of preppers really latched onto it because it was extremely believable. It was very raw and in your face, real world what's going to happen without rule of law. It was explainable and it was different because it didn't involve zombies or aliens, but it was believable, explainable, and it was a real Teotihuacan event that we could really kind of prepare for. And many readers of that book never read the foreword, which I did. He describes that he was one of the people to bring the EMP threat before Congress, but timing is everything with Congress. It was absolutely overshadowed and largely ignored because 9/11 took place and it kept all eyes on our response to 9/11 and anything else going on, it was just never addressed in the same fashion again. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and I've seen a little bit come out of both Congress and the intelligence community in the last maybe 10 years with there's some renewed interest in EMPs, but I think most of that is really concerns of foreign actors using directed energy weapons, not like this high altitude explosion we talk about. So, what exactly is an EMP? In simple terms, it is an a burst of electromagnetic radiation. But not all EMPs are created equal. We typically talk about these kind of two main types. There's the high altitude nuclear EMP, the HEMP. And this is the one that gets the most attention. This is what preppers love to talk about. So imagine a nuclear weapon detonated high in the atmosphere, say between 25 and 300 miles above the Earth's surface. And the gamma rays released from the detonation interact with the atmosphere, creating this massive, rapidly expanding electromagnetic field. This is what's called ionization of the atmosphere. And this ionization gives the atmosphere the ability to conduct electricity. And what is conduction? Remember from high school physics class, conduction means it's actually touching something. So all these little ionized molecules in the air now can conduct energy. So what actually happens is this: high energy gamma rays from that nuclear blast interact with the atmospheric air molecules and they knock electrons free via Compton scattering, or what they call the Compton effect. So now these high energy Compton electrons are then deflected by the Earth's magnetic field, causing them to accelerate and emit electromagnetic radiation, which forms the EMP. Basically, the atmosphere can convect electricity because the air molecules themselves are now ionized. And I hope that makes sense.
It does to me. I have a little bit more experience than your average farmhand at this, but yes, basically you are overcharging the atmosphere to the point where the air itself can become a conductor. And you do see the same thing with the plasma that comes off of lightning bolts. If it's a high enough voltage and high enough amperage lightning bolt, you kind of smell that ozone in the air. That is ionized oxygen that you're sniffing. And this is where the high altitude nuclear EMP, or the HEMP. They're also known in some fields as HANDS, those high altitude nuclear detonations. And some very specific types of satellites are designed to detect a nuclear detonation and be able to shut down prior to being completely disrupted. So remember, electromagnetism moves at the speed of light. So they basically go into nuclear safe mode until the signals from Earth to reboot can actually make it through all of that ionized radiation and get that radio burst and the reboot signal through that initial blast signature. Now, the other kind of non nuclear EMP, these are less powerful, but they are still a concern. They can be generated by specialized weapons. A lot of time, these are called the directed energy weapons or DEWs, but they're designed to create an electromagnetic pulse without a nuclear explosion. Think of them more as localized disruptions, though still potentially very damaging to electronics. In the movie Ocean's 11, they called it a pinch, and that's what they used to disrupt the power supply to the building and the casino that they were robbing. But a non nuclear EMP or an NNEMP is a directed energy device that generates a concentrated electromagnetic pulse to disable electronic systems without causing physical damage or explosions. Unlike their nuclear cousins, NNEMPs are smaller, they're way more precise, and they can utilize technology like high powered microwaves to fry electronics at close range. We even have examples, declassified examples, like the U.S. military's Champ cruise missile and the Thor microwave weapon system. They offer precision targeting for electronic warfare. And it's one of those things to kind of be aware of the difference.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that I think a lot of preppers sort of pool all this stuff together and they go, "Oh, this is what an EMP would do." But in real life, yeah, that's what a directed energy weapon might do. But an EMP from a nuke is far more of a variable. Now, why is this burst of energy so concerning? Because it can induce powerful electrical currents in long conductors. And this is important. Think about power lines or communication cables or pipes or the train tracks. This is something from the Carrington event that I want to talk about later, that the train tracks would arc because of their long conductors. So these induced currents can overload and damage unprotected electronic systems. We're talking about everything from the power grid itself to our computers and even, most modern appliances, let's say. And while an EMP is often a man-made threat, nature has its own way of sending us little electromagnetic surprises. And that brings us to the CME, the coronal mass ejection. And what is a CME?
CME.
So what that's awesome. What is a CME? So picture this: the sun. And occasionally it erupts, throwing out massive clouds of magnetized plasma. That's my best Austin Powers. Magnetized plasma and radiation into space, right? It tosses all this out. And if one of those is directed towards the Earth, it can create a geomagnetic storm. And we have seen these. We've seen these even recently. Now, how is this different from an EMP? Well, a CME induced geomagnetic storm generates currents in the Earth's magnetic field, which in turn can induce currents in long conductors, um, like the train tracks or the power lines. And these effects are similar in some ways to that hemp or high altitude EMP in that they can affect the power grid, but the pulse characteristics are way different. A nuclear EMP is an extremely fast, high frequency pulse, while that CME is actually a lower frequency event. The difference in that basically means that they affect different types of electronics and infrastructure in slightly different ways. It also means that we would have a heads up of at least a few hours if a CME was on the way. Many times we get days or weeks notices from NASA and other agencies that keep an eye on the sun. So we generally have an idea that those things are coming because it's just a slower event, and you've got time to throw things in the Faraday bag or whatever. But EMPs and CMEs both can lead to some widespread outages.
And this isn't just theoretical. We're not just making shit up off the top of our head here. We actually have historical examples that show the potential of these kind of events. And I really want to go over the historical events so we can point to and talk about what actually happened rather than just, well, it's a EMP. I guess I'll throw all my stuff into a trash can and hope for the best. Let's start with let's start with the Carrington event. We're going back a ways here. So 1859. This is the gold standard of CMEs. It was actually the most powerful geomagnetic storm in recorded history. And it was so powerful, like you were talking about, with that ionizing radiation and the air itself becoming a conductor and conductors then kind of feeding off of that in a feedback loop. Telegraph systems went haywire. It was shocking operators. It even set telegraph stations on fire. So the paper that they would tap everything out with, the arc between the contact points would set those papers on fire, and it led to blazes. Imagine that happening today with hyper connected, technology dependent everything that we've got going on in the world. If a Carrington level event happened right now, some experts predict widespread grid collapse, potentially for months or even years. This is where preppers kind of focus on, well, if the sun gets angry, I don't really have anywhere to turn. And so they try to prepare for it. But let's go much more recently. Let's go to 1989, the Quebec blackout. A less severe, but it was still a significant CME. It caused a 9-hour power outage across Quebec, Canada, and it knocked out Hydro-Quebec's power grid, leaving millions without electricity. And this gives us a more recent, more tangible example of how solar activity can affect modern infrastructure. This happened in March 1989. And the geomagnetic storm occurred as part of a severe to extreme solar storm during like mid-March 1989. The most notable of those eruptions being a geomagnetic storm that struck Earth on March 13th. And that storm caused a 9-hour outage of the electricity transmission system. So it wasn't that the plant fried, but it couldn't push any energy out over the wires that it had in place. And it was very rapid. So a lot of other historically significant solar storms occurred later in 1989 during a very active period of the sun. It was solar cycle 22, but it just kept pumping out ionized plasma and magnetic fields, and it did some pretty severe damage. And then going into the nuclear side of things, all of the Cold War nuclear testing that we did, and this is something I do really like to explore. While these weren't deliberately aimed at creating EMPs over populated areas for destructive purposes, we definitely saw some atmospheric nuclear tests during the Cold War, and it did demonstrate the EMP effect. For example, back in the day, in 1962, Starfish Prime was a high-altitude nuclear detonation.
That sounds like that's just such a cool name.
Right?
Starfish. It sounds like if SpongeBob was a transformer.
I can see that.
Starfish
I can
Prime.
definitely see
it's just
that.
cool. I don't know. Anyway, sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
I will say some of the code names that we have for operations are pretty badass, like Gothic Serpent.
Yeah, that's a good one too. We should probably go over that. We should do an episode on acronyms, like military acronyms and operation names, because some of them are just cool.
I could definitely do an episode on Mogadishu, so we'll look into it. But
anyway,
Starfish Prime. This happened in 1962. It was a high altitude nuclear test. And like I said, it was 1.4 megatons. It was done over the Pacific, just kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But it caused electrical damage to Hawaii. So streetlights failed, burglar alarms were going off, and it was over 900 miles away. That's a long, long distance. It was an unintended demonstration of the vast reach of an EMP. And there's also, I think it was the atomic anti-nuclear test, but there's video floating around on the internet. It's taken from several miles away. And in that video, you see the flash. Then about 3 seconds later, you kind of see the film get grainy or staticky, and you start to hear this like buzz. And then you see the pulse of the actual blast wave moving across the ground. And about 20 seconds after that, you actually hear the bang. And it's interesting because that EMP is moving at the speed of light or relatively close to it. And that static interference was actually the EM pulse or electromagnetic pulse interacting with the camera itself. So you can see those effects.
That's cool. I want to find that video. We should post that. That's pretty cool. And this is actually right where I want to inject my opinion a little bit, if that's okay, Chris.
Of course.
I want to play this scenario out and chat a bit about that. So, we have a couple other nuclear explosions in recent-ish history, those being Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and those were obviously the nuclear attacks in World War II. And there were no reported major electrical outages or failures as a result of those. And that's because they were detonated not on the ground, but several hundred meters above the ground. But they were basically detonated on as close to the ground as you can get. They weren't detonated in high altitude. So we know that in order to cause an actual EMP, we need high altitude detonation. Like I said earlier, 25 to 300 miles over the ground. So here's the point I want to make. If you think an EMP is a super likely event and it's way high up on your risk matrix, what you're saying is that a bad actor, like a foreign government or a terrorist organization, is going to get a hold of a nuclear weapon. And the only real world nuclear EMP we've ever seen was this 1.4 megaton bomb you're talking about, Chris. So that is 7 times larger than the most common nuke that the Russians are selling out there on the dark web, Turkish bazaar flea markets or whatever. That's the RS-24 Yars. That's about 200 kilotons or 0.2 megaton. So in fact, the largest nuke in service today anywhere in the world is the US B-83. That was made by Lawrence Livermore Labs in the early 80s. That's about 1.3 megatons. So that's still smaller than the nuke that caused the EMP in Hawaii. So what you're saying, if you're on protein EMP that's going to take everything out, you're saying that someone gets a hold of a big nuke, and rather than using it against a military target or a civilian soft target or Washington, D.C., what they're going to do is somehow get this thing into the stratosphere over our homeland and then use it to attack everything except our hardened military targets. Just think about the likelihood of that. Now,
You're talking about wasted weapon theory, right?
that's kind of what it is. Yeah, it's like, why, if you could get a hold of this weapon, of a perfectly good nuke, why would you waste a perfectly good nuke on not attacking something that would actually make a difference, like our hardened military targets, like, I don't know, the NORAD or something, or something like that, or Washington, D.C. You could take out all of Washington, D.C. with that nuke, with that 1.3 megaton nuke, if you manage to steal the single largest nuke that exists in anybody's arsenal anywhere in the world. But instead, what you're going to do is somehow get that thing into the stratosphere and then cause an EMP. So like, you would waste a perfectly good nuclear weapon. I don't get that. So as for the CME, we have seen some pretty severe geomagnetic storms recently, from that 1989 event that Chris just talked about to just earlier this year when the aurora borealis was visible into the southern latitudes. just like records show happening in the Carrington event. And there were no widespread disruptions of service at all, right? Everything kind of kept working fine.
And I don't want to discredit the high altitude nuclear EMP theory, um, because it is a threat. And you said something about hardened military targets. Why don't you kind of break down why our military isn't as susceptible to EMPs and CMEs? Because I think this is a very, very important piece of the puzzle that we have yet to touch on.
Yeah, sure. Good call. And I appreciate you following me down this tangent shaped rabbit hole. But I have been involved in a number of DoD programs and product developments that have focused on hardening military equipment to, I'm using quotation figures, EMP proof them. But this is generally accomplished by testing gear to certain military standards or mil specs. You've heard that mil spec before. Well, um, the big one is mil standard 461. And in fact, today, post 2015, mil spec 461 Golf. And that tests electromagnetic interference, EMI, emissions, and susceptibility of electronic, electrical, and electrical mechanical equipment and subsystems to ensure that they perform reliably in electromagnetic environments. So it kind of sets the requirements for conducted emissions, like think about cables and leads. We talked about there's conduction and there's this convected energy as well. So radiated emissions from electromagnetic fields and then like conducted susceptibility. So basically there's a couple of different test categories that I don't really need to get into, but there's conducted susceptibility. So we'll use 461 to assess how equipment handles conducted electrical interference, including things like lightning strikes, and then uh, radiated susceptibility. So they'll use 461G to evaluate how equipment responds to external magnetic fields and pulses. So basically, everything the military deems as essential is mil-spec 461G hardened. And you can actually look for this spec on some, I'll say, consumer available electronics. There are a lot of things that are tested to some particular mil-spec 461 profile. So what I'm saying, an EMP isn't going to knock all of the airplanes out of the sky or stop our tanks and missiles for operating. Like, it's just going to affect the sort of civilian infrastructure stuff because the military's still going to be fine. And that's what I was getting at when I said you're going to, basically waste a perfectly good nuke on not being a bomb. And like Chris, even when you were in the Army, all your Humvees, all the electronic equipment and electromechanical equipment that made up a Humvee, those were all hardened to mil-spec 461. So in an event of an EMP, that Humvee was still going to start up and go.
Everything except the people.
That's that's right.
I will say if you are somebody who has a pacemaker or like a cochlear implant hearing aid, those may not be mil-spec 461 tested. So you are at a higher risk either of losing your hearing entirely or your pacemaker going out. But again, the likelihood of somebody launching that nuke into orbit just to detonate all the way up there and not make any impact on the ground other than hopefully shutting some stuff down, it's a long shot.
It seems kind of silly to me. Yeah, I was thinking about, so you've got the pacemaker or the implants or something that may not be 461 hardened. I was picturing like just kind of like Oscar the Grouch in this big copper garbage can, like your own little like little home slash copper Faraday cage.
I can see that. I can also see if the electricity pulse and the current inside of that copper gets a little too high, that copper can turn red hot like an induction coil welder. And then you have stewed grouch
Oh yeah,
instead of.
it's a little stewed grouch. So Chris, but honestly, let's talk about this. How serious are these kinds of threats?
The consensus among experts is that both an EMP and a severe CME, they do pose existential threats to our modern society. So the primary concern would be a power grid collapse. Without electricity, everything grinds to a halt. no running water because the pumps stop, no refrigeration, no heating or air conditioning, no communication because cell towers are down, the internet is gone, no fuel pumps, no ATMs, no traffic lights for those of you who still don't know how a four-way stop works. Learn your traffic laws. But that would be kind of phase one. After the power grid collapses, there would be severe economic devastation. The economic impact would be pretty well catastrophic. Supply chains, they would completely crumble and break down. Industries would cease production. Financial system would collapse. This is why it's important to get ahead of a major threat, because if it's already happened, the odds of being able to buy anything off of Amazon to complete your prep list is nil. Once the economic devastation is kind of through, or while that's going on, we would probably see a societal breakdown. Without basic services, clean water, food distribution, rule of law would kind of collapse, and civil unrest and this societal breakdown become a very real possibility. And the longer the outage, the more severe the consequences. When we were looking at the power outage that affected the Northeast United States in 2003, that was a massive outage. And thankfully, not a whole lot of people got hurt because most communities came together for things like block parties to barbecue all of their meat and things that were spoiling anyways. But there's a very real possibility that that could have gone a different direction. And unlike a localized natural disaster, recovering from a widespread EMP or even a severe CME event, it could take months, years, possibly even decades, depending on the extent of the damage to critical infrastructure like transformers. They help with your electricity and making sure that you don't fry your fingers every time you plug something in. But if the transformer goes down or blows, the ability to manufacture and transport replacements is going to be affected because there's no power to create them. But something that it's really, really important to point out, and I brought it up a little bit ago, these CME and EMP events are the biggest threat to long conductors. So things like cars are less susceptible. We've seen cars struck by lightning, they still drive. And even in the real world EMP in Hawaii, there were no reports of widespread vehicle failures, probably because the rubber tires provided enough electrical insulation and there were no sensitive electronics in cars back in 1962. But without that, and with our wireless world, arcing along those train tracks isn't as big of a threat as it probably was 100 years ago. So we've got some flexibility. The key point is we just don't know exactly what a CME or an EMP would do.
Yeah, and I like what you said about the lightning strike because lightning is an EMP, right? I mean, just shuffling across the carpet and touching your friend with your finger is an EMP, although it's lower current. But you're right, we've seen like cars get struck by lightning and they're still going, and it is a really good call on the cars, like the in the Hawaii event there weren't a lot of electronics at the time, and there is a counter argument to that. Obviously cars didn't have computers back then, and that is true. The first real computer in a car, I think Volkswagen had a electronic fuel injection in like 68. um, but the counterpoint could be made that electronic systems are more hardened now because one, we have a better understanding of EMI, and we have so many computers around everywhere that they are designed around EMI. Like we talk about even like CE testing now and EMC testing, like which is electronic compatibility directive. And what that means is pretty much every piece of electronics we have has to pass some kind of standard because we have so many electronics that they would just keep interfering with each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that kind of brings up a story from way back in the day. So before a lot of those standards were implemented, before there really was EMI shielding of any kind, there was a huge opportunity for cross traffic. I remember when I was a kid, um, I had like Power Ranger walkie talkies, and I had a conversation with somebody on their cell phone who was within range, but somehow my little childhood walkie talkie was picking up on their conversation, and I completely disrupted whoever they were talking to and hijacked the distant end that they were expecting.
Absolutely. No, that can and did actually happen because we had so much crosstalk and we didn't have the standards at the time for EMI and EMC testing. So even now, your little $30 Baofeng Chinese radio, it has to have some amount of CE and EMC standard built in before you can import that to the US. So yeah, they are actually a little more shielded now than electronics would have been back then. Now, let's talk about likelihood. So, EMP attack, right? That's the big one. The likelihood of a nation state launching a high altitude EMP attack is considered low by everyone, including the intelligence community. Given that one, the severe consequences and the potential for immediate retaliation of against anybody who tried it. Um, but the proliferation of nuclear weapons means that the capability does exist. And some rogue states or terrorist groups might consider it. But it's just so unlikely because like I said, you're wasting a perfectly good nuke on this EMP. And the intelligence community is just far more worried these days about the North Korean hacker with a laptop that can do almost the same stuff, as far as taking down our grid or some of our critical infrastructure without all of the time and energy and actually perpetrating it on or above US soil. So the EMP attack is just the likelihood is considered very low.
And we know as soon as you launch a missile, our our intelligence network knows not only where you launched it from and exactly when you launched it, but we have to have at some point a trajectory. Obviously that can change once it's in
Sure.
orbit because it can stay up there for a long time, but within minutes there's a threat and interceptors ready to go to avoid that type of scenario. And I guarantee our intelligence apparatus can see exactly where you were and probably what you were doing that morning before you decided to push the big red button.
Oh, yeah, we know what you had for dinner the night before, 100%. So the other one is that severe CME, right? The likelihood of another Carrington level event is not a question of if, but it is a question of when. So most scientists estimate that like a 12% chance of a severe solar storm hitting the Earth in the next decade. And while we would have some warning time before something happened because of obviously our solar observations, all that kind of stuff, it's often a matter of hours, probably not days or weeks, unless they're seeing some geomagnetic energy on the sun leading up to it. So, a potential event that could severely disrupt power grids, communication networks, the internet, things like that, the risk is fairly high. They say there's a couple studies I read that estimate between a 1.6% and 12% probability of like a global internet disruption from a solar storm. So that's pretty significant. So where should a CME find itself on your risk matrix? 12% chance in the next 10 years that we may have significant disruptions.
And this is not meant to scare you. It's meant to inform you and empower you to be your own stakeholder and prepare. So, really, what steps can any off the shelf prepper take? What steps can our listeners take to help themselves prepare for this? So, AC, let's kind of go back and forth on some of these if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I like that. There obviously are, and most of this stuff is things we've talked about before, right? This is just the pragmatic be ready steps everybody should have. With one exception, I will say, like there's the Faraday cages, right? And I want to start with Faraday cages. I think there is a lot of confusion around these, like for smaller critical electronics like radios, spare phones, medical devices, external hard drives. I have one. I have a little Faraday bag that I keep in my safe that I like has a cell phone with all kinds of documentation and stuff on it. They can offer some amount of protection, obviously. And this can be as simple as like the metal trash can with a lid and then lined with cardboard as an insulator. Now, I want to dispel one myth that I hear a lot, and that is that people are like, "Oh, you can just use an old microwave." Uh, Old microwaves do not work as Faraday cages. I'm sorry, they don't, and you can fight me on it. But a a microwave, they do have some amount of EM shielding, but they're shielded specifically for that 2.4 gigahertz frequency that the oven operates on, not the broader range of frequencies present in things like an EMP or a CME. Um, and they also have these small intentional openings on purpose. So you can test a microwave's limited effectiveness by placing your cell phone inside and then calling it. If it rings, it's not a good Faraday cage because you've just tested its ability to block cell frequencies. And cell phones, they use a wide range of frequencies. So when you call it, there's really no telling what frequency you're using, but cell phone frequencies do operate all the way from like that 600 megahertz all the way up into the, I think now with satellite stuff, even the 30 to 50 gigahertz, like satellites or cell phones have this very wide range now. So you could do this exact same test with an AM FM radio. You could turn that radio on, put it in the microwave, and then close the door. And if you can still hear the radio, then you have just dispelled that myth on your own that an old microwave will work as a Faraday cage. So
Actually, I want to kind of bring something up on that. If you've ever looked really close at your microwave oven door, it has that metal screen in there and it's got the little itty bitty holes all the way through it,
mhm,
right? So when the light's on, you can just see
right.
through it and it's an optical illusion. Those holes are tuned to the frequency of the microwave and it's designed to break up those specific waveforms. So there's three things that all waves have, and that's frequency, amplitude, and wavelength. And with that 2.4 gigahertz frequency of the microwave oven, the wavelength is broken up by those little screens. So you can put something else in there, and if it's a much higher frequency or much lower frequency, it's not necessarily going to work the same.
Oh, that's a really good call. And that is a really good call. I do want to reiterate all EMPs are not created equal. So, simple steps like properly grounding your electronics will offer some level of protection against electromagnetic interference. And that's all an EMP or a CME is. So, depending on the severity, frequency, and energy, you may actually be already protected.
And that's a really, really good thing to know. And it kind of goes into my next one, which is analog backups. You don't solely want to rely on electronics. Have a paper map. There's a great company called MyTopo that you can get customized maps to make it to your bug out site, to make it through your neighborhood, even just to play with and get your navigation skills down. But you can go through our website, go to MyTopo, order a custom map, and then you have a permanent hard copy that you don't have to worry about any type of electronic interference with. Same with a compass, a manual compass. That one, depending on how severe the EM pulse is, it could kind of throw off your compass, but that will dissipate within about an hour or so. Hand crank solar radio, physical library of essential information. You can get some of the books that Jennifer Rader wrote and add those to your library. Get them now, have them ready to go whenever you need to. And you are building your own EMP shelter plan by having these on hand.
Yeah, good call. The other one, obviously, I'm all about off grid power. I always like to tell everybody just have some amount of off grid power, have something. And so solar generators or, portable solar panels, those kinds of things, they can be invaluable for recharging devices, even keeping like a refrigerator running. So, or like your CPAP or your medical equipment. So having those kinds of things in some kind of Faraday type thing, whether it's the big garbage can that fits your little portable solar generator or something like that, having that in stock and then being able to deploy that after some kind of event. I mean, that really it can definitely save the day. It may actually save your life.
Another thing that will definitely save your life is having water, food on hand. It's kind of foundational for any type of disaster, and we talk about it all the time. With an EMP or a CME, assume that it's going to last longer than 3 days. So we're going beyond the scope of what ready.gov and FEMA suggest. We're now talking about no power, no running water, no grocery stores, no place that will accept your credit card, even if they did have power. So, kind of something to think about and work into your plans. Even if you've got an extra $50 a month at the end of your budget, start working that into a bag of rice, a bag of beans, some element packets, or just kind of building your own emergency. I don't want to say doomsday, but building your own EMP survival plan.
Yeah, you're right that the grocery stores are not going to be open. Also, what's not going to be open is the gas station. So, fuel storage is one. Consider how you would transport or pump fuel if the gas stations were inoperable. So, just having some amount of gas on hand. I personally like to buy avgas. I've got a couple different fuel stores. I've got Super Clear, and then I have avgas. And there's a couple reasons to have each, but they both store for a very long time. You could add things like stable to them to have them store a lot longer. The downside for avgas is that it is leaded, so it's not really good in super brand new anything with a O2 sensor, basically. It's not really great for anything that's, um, like new cars, but it's really good for, like, old dirt bikes and things like that, versus, like, your super clear gas that isn't leaded, and your chainsaw is gonna like a little less, but having some fuel stored can go a long way. Even if your car doesn't work after an EMP for one reason or another, that can be a super valuable trading commodity.
Another thing that you're going to be potentially missing out on is first aid and medical supplies. Assume that pharmacies and a grocery store pharmacy, even the off the counter stuff, is just going to be closed, non existent, not resupplied, anything like that. And this is where Jace Medical, you can have a Jace case on hand for when shit hits the fan and you're good to go. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So, again, you can go through stakeholderprepping.com and get to Jace there, and you actually get a solid quality product that you can add into your preps. Great, great plan.
And $10 off from us. So yeah, check out our blog or just the website. You'll see all of our discount codes. One thing that I want to touch on, Chris, if we have time, obviously, is there are some products out there, like one's called EMP Shield, and they claim that they will protect your home and car in an EMP event. And they do have some test data to back it up, including some MilSpec 461G test data. But I think a lot of people don't understand how these products work and if they're actually useful. So I do want to talk about how they work. And here's the deal is these products, they are basically a shunt. They sense high current coming in on the power lines or the conductor, like let's say the FM antenna in your car, and then they shunt that power immediately. Like they're super hyper fast. They sense that dangerous power spike coming in, and then they shunt that voltage. And so they basically keep the sensitive electronics safe. But remember what we just talked about. There are different ways an EMP will cause energy to travel. In a conduction event where energy is traveling down those long conductors, like you talked about, like power lines, a product like this may actually be beneficial. But it's basically just a surge protector at that point. The other way an EMP works is by ionizing the atmosphere, allowing the energy to pass through the air via electronic convection. So all of your electronics are still susceptible whether or not you have a power shunt in place, because that ionized air, if it's touching anything, it can react with anything. So I hope that makes sense. But I've seen these products, and I've always said having like a whole home surge protector is actually a very good thing to do. And
Yeah.
that's just because of, like, the dirty power coming in, or like a weaponized power grid that we've talked about before. But that will do double duty with a haha duty. That will do double duty with an EMP strike that would come along those long line conductors like your power lines.
And we're not trying to scare you. We're not trying to discredit any of these threats. What we're trying to do is explain these threats pragmatically. EMPs and CMEs are not one size fits all. They have a lot of variables to them. The size of the detonation, the amplitude, the frequency, the wavelength of all of the different frequencies that are coming off of that single point all at one time. You may have protection against the 2.4 gigahertz, but a gamma ray is just going to punch right through your electronic shielding. So there's no way to really tell what is going to cause a takedown of your electronics. The amount of energy it would take to completely take down all of our infrastructure, like some people suggest, maybe it shouldn't be quite as high on your risk matrix as it is. And hopefully, we've explained and defended our position on this topic adequately. There's still a lot of unknown. So, if this is a major concern for you, I would still recommend looking into the Mill Standard 461 Golf. You can also look at Mill Standard 464. It's not as comprehensive, but just look at what those requirements are and kind of prepare yourself accordingly.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And if we could throw some actual last minute factual math at you real quick. So the Hawaii EMP that is in 1962 that you talked about, it was 900 miles from the source. And it didn't take down Hawaii, but it did like blow some streetlights out and cause some burglar alarms to go off and things like that. So we can assume that if you drew like an 1,800-mile diameter around the middle of the US, let's say you set off an EMP of that size. By the way, that EMP was bigger than any nuke in production today or in service today. If whatever, over Kansas, over the middle of the US. Um, Only about half of the US would be impacted as bad or worse than Hawaii was in 1962. And that is assuming all of the things we talked about are true. Like a bad actor gets a nuke bigger than anything in service today and then takes it into the upper atmosphere and then detonates it. And instead of actually using that nuclear weapon against a hardened military or civilian target. So I think that's like the last point I'd like to make. Just that gosh, it seems so highly unlikely that even if you got a hold of the biggest nuke in production today, or in service today, not in production, but in service today, that it still wouldn't like take down the US with an EMP, assuming that, I guess yields are linear, right? I'm making a huge assumption that a 1.2 megaton nuke is twice as big as like a zero point 0.6 megaton nuke or whatever, you know what I mean? But one thing I did look up, Chris, do you know what the largest nuclear bomb that's ever been lost is?
Ever been lost?
Yeah.
Huh. I know Tsar Bomba was the largest one ever tested and detonated, but
Yeah, that was
actually lost? I
that was a
don't
big
know.
Russian one. The big Russian one, that thing was huge, 50 megatons or something silly. But the largest nuke ever lost and not detonated was the 1958 Taibbi Island bomb. So that was a 3.8 megaton Mark 15 bomb that they jettisoned from a B-47 over Wausau Sound, Georgia, when it had a midair collision. And I think it might still be there, or if If it's not, they haven't told us they found it. But looking at this linearly, then a nuke of that size, that 3.8 megaton, would probably do the kind of damage to the entire US that that 1.4 megaton bomb did back in 1962. So I'm I'm
Interesting.
I'm setting you up for a plausibility here. If there was a possibility of a bad actor getting a hold of a nuclear bomb that was big enough to actually cause that kind of damage, then that's kind of where I'd probably send you. Go dive and find the one in Wausau Sound that I think was 3.8 megatons.
And a lot of this is just to put this into comparison and kind of draw some parallels off of it. Imagine that you are in a water balloon fight with your kids or your neighbors or the whole block or, red versus blue, whatever you want to come up with. But you're in a water balloon fight and you have this perfectly filled, perfectly round water balloon. Are you going to throw that water balloon at an individual person and hope that you hit your target? Or are you going to use a slingshot and rocket it up over the entire field and then burst it at altitude and get everybody wet? That's what we're talking about with a hardened nuclear target or military target or a civilian target or something like that, and the destruction that a nuke can do on the ground or close to it. Or are you just gonna launch it into oblivion and hope that everybody gets wet?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I hate to play the what if game with you know, like these terroristic examples because it's going to get us on a watch list. We're like, all right, this is what I would do. I would, like I don't want to, I don't want to get into that. What I would do is I would dive down in Wausau Sound. I'd find that 3.8 megaton and I'd launch it over Kansas. But yeah, you're exactly right that it just for something to be big enough to cause that kind of severe widespread outage here to make a huge difference. It's just such a waste of a perfectly good nuke, and it's so much effort. Think about like we keep things out of our airspace on purpose. So you're saying that somehow this nuke has to get over our airspace. I know you had mentioned the ballistic missile angle. I was actually thinking like the stolen jet or something, like flying it over the US. But either way, we're going to see that thing coming and we're not going to let it in. So it just seems that there are so many more likely catastrophic things that we could be prepping for. And yeah, there is this sort of Venn diagram of if I prepare for things over here, like the EMP, then that does prepare me for a whole lot of stuff that's more likely to happen and vice versa. But for me, like I said, I have some simple pragmatic steps I take. I make sure everything in my home is adequately grounded. I have a big metal outbuilding with my emergency power in it, and that is adequately grounded. So I feel like I'm pretty prepared against some kind of EMP CME, but not totally. Like I will admit that no, I haven't covered my entire property in copper tinfoil. Because it's just not that high up on my risk matrix.
And completely cost prohibitive too. I like what you said about the hackers being a bigger threat in terms of bringing our power grid down because a nuke takes nuclear scientists, nuclear physicists, rocket engineers. It takes the funding to get the raw materials, whereas a hacker, they can learn most of what they need to from the dark web and YouTube University. So, cost benefit analysis, I think our power grid being hacked is a much, much higher likelihood than a high altitude EMP.
And we don't go down like the conspiracy theory rabbit holes very often, but yeah, in my opinion, I just believe that there are lower effort, lower energy ways to attack our critical infrastructure with the same sort of net result as an EMP, but without all that time and money and logistics and effort that the EMP would take, if that makes sense.
100% agree with you. I think that's about going to wrap this one up, but join us next week. We have, as always, a brand new exciting topic. We're going to leave that one close to the vest until next week, but join us then. And until then, remember, you are your own stakeholder.